Well, it's being hailed as a historic breakthrough and a bold political gesture. U.S. President Barack Obama has announced that Washington's restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba after more than half a century of mistrust and hostility. The White House plans include efforts to push the U.S. Congress to lift a 54-year-old trade embargo, easing travel restrictions and increasing telecommunications links, and reviewing the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Patty Culhane has more from Washington.
In many ways, Cuba appears a country stuck in time in a long-ago era, in large part due to the U.S. embargo. For more than 50 years, the U.S. has tried to freeze their economy, sponsored an invasion. There were even plots to assassinate their leader, Fidel Castro. But now U.S. President Barack Obama says he's changing U.S. policy toward Cuba.
It does not serve America's interests or the Cuban people to try to push Cuba towards collapse. Even if that worked, and it hasn't for 50 years, we know from hard-earned experience that countries are more likely to enjoy lasting transformation if their people are not subjected to chaos.
These are the most dramatic images of the shift. American contractor Alan Gross, back on U.S. soil, imprisoned in Cuba for 5 years for distributing communications equipment.
A judicious lesson that I've learned from this experience is that freedom is not free.
The U.S. doesn't want to set a precedent, so they are insisting that Gross was released on humanitarian grounds. 3 Cubans convicted of espionage in 2001 have been sent home, and a Cuban who spied for the Americans has been released. They aren't releasing his name, but they say he served almost 20 years in prison. But it's not just a prisoner swap. President Obama is shifting economic policy as well. The U.S. plans to open an embassy in Havana, increase the numbers of Americans who can travel to Cuba. American banks will be able to operate on the island, and U.S. companies can increase exports. But Obama cannot get rid of the overall embargo, a point highlighted by the Cuban president.
This doesn't mean that the major issues have been resolved. The economic embargo that creates a lot of human and economic damage to our country must cease.
Senator Menendez, if you would, please.
The embargo is unlikely to be lifted. Many in Congress were quick to express outrage.
It's a reward that a totalitarian regime does not deserve. Cubans are less free today than they were yesterday, and I believe the announcement only perpetuates the Castro regime's decades of repression.
There may not be much the Congress can do. The president sets policy, and for the first time in more than half a century, he's saying it's time for a change in Cuba. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Some background now on the antagonism between the U.S. and Cuba, which goes back to 1959, when an armed revolt led by Fidel Castro established a socialist state. Now, Cuba then nationalized all American businesses in 1960, and the U.S. imposed the economic embargo. In 1961, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro in a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs. Then in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis almost led to a U.S. invasion after the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. There was an easing of tensions in 2009 when Barack Obama came to power in the U.S. He lifted some restrictions on travel and remittances to Cuba, but then later that year, in December, U.S. citizen Alan Gross was detained, which froze relations once again. Some Cubans are welcoming the news. People across the country were tuned in to hear President Raul Castro's televised address, in which he informed Cubans of the breakthrough. But others say they're concerned that the economic embargo remains in place.
We're very happy, and we've been waiting many years for this. May things continue so that Cuba and the United States have good relations. The embargo is absurd already. All these measures that have been taken against our country have been absurd.
Let's see if the embargo can be lifted also for better relations, so our quality of life can improve, so we can get more food, more things from other countries.
Al Jazeera's Latin America editor Lucia Newman has more on the Cuban reaction.
This is more than just a shift in policy. It is a historic move. There is no way to overstate the impact of this announcement in Cuba, especially for millions and millions of Cubans over many generations that have lived under the cloud of the Cold War on both sides of the Florida Strait, separated not only by ideology, but by an economic and political embargo. The president of Cuba, Raul Castro, addressed his people on state television, announcing that the United States had agreed to his government's long-standing demand for the release of 3 intelligence agents known in Cuba as the 3 heroes. They'd been held since 1998 in U.S. prisons, and we understand that at this hour they are back on the island, reunited with their families. He also recognized that there are still deep differences between both countries, particularly their views on democracy and on human rights. But he said that it was time for both countries to engage in what he called the art of civilized coexistence. The U.S. economic embargo, of course, cannot be lifted unilaterally by President Barack Obama. That's up to the U.S. Congress. But by agreeing to renew diplomatic relations, both countries have taken a significant first step towards normalizing ties between two countries that are only separated by 170 kilometers.
Latin American leaders have welcomed the U.S. decision. Cuba's close ally, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, has praised President Obama.
We must recognize President Barack Obama's gesture, a gesture of courage and historical necessity that has been perhaps the most important step in his presidency, and Cuba standing there with the cultured, educated Cubans, full of dignity, and with President Barack Obama saying that he cannot continue insisting on a policy that tries to bring the collapse of Cuba as a way of doing politics. It seems to be an historic rectification.
For more, let's speak to Larry Luxner. He's the news editor for the Washington Diplomat and a contributing writer and correspondent for CubaNews. Thank you. Let me ask you, Larry Luxner, first of all, about the overall significance. We heard our Latin America editor there, Lucia Newman, talking about how it couldn't be overstated, the impact that it's going to have in Cuba.
This is absolutely a historic moment, I believe. For the first time in 53 years, the United States will have a full-fledged embassy in Havana, and the Cuban government will have a full-fledged embassy in Washington. It is, in fact, very hard to overstate the significance of this event. Of course, it doesn't mean the end of the embargo. Congress must act to end the embargo. That's enshrined in U.S. law. But this sets the stage. And I think the U.S. business community is obviously very solidly behind this. You have large segments of the American public that want to travel to Cuba and that don't understand why it's possible to travel to China, even to North Korea, but not to an island 90 miles from our shores.
So what's made it possible to get to this deal now?
I believe there's been a convergence of factors that seemingly for the first time in as long as I can remember covering Cuba have come together. One, I think, is the drop in the price of oil, which made Venezuela very nervous about continuing to supply Cuba at subsidized oil at preferential rates when its own economy is imploding. The Cuban government obviously is concerned about where its fuel will be coming from. Its efforts at offshore exploration have really gone nowhere. And at the same time, there's been pressure from other Latin American countries on the United States. The Summit of the Americas, which is about to take place in Panama next year, has invited Cuba for the first time. And I think it would be awkward for the United States not to be able to talk to Cuba at the summit. In addition, the Republican Party will be taking over Congress next month, and I believe President Obama wanted to have some sort of a legacy that he could put through before Republicans are in control, and that it would be a way to make a permanent change in our relationship with Cuba.
What would you say to those who criticize this deal because they say Obama was not able to elicit any real reforms in Cuba?
Politically, that is correct. There have not been any significant reforms. But what's the alternative? Continuing a policy that obviously has gotten us nowhere? At least this way we're talking. It's better to have relations than to not have relations. And I think history has shown that it made no sense to keep Cuba on a list of state sponsors of terrorism, along with Iran, Sudan, and Syria. Even North Korea has been taken off that list. So I think a convergence of factors have shown that it's time for a change. And also those who are most in favor of keeping the status quo, they're either dying out or their voices are no longer as powerful as they once were. And I think that's evidenced by the exile community in Miami. Even their attitudes are changing.
All right. Thank you, Larry Luxner, live to us.